The one thing that I want everyone to understand from the get-go is that the version of British history in Tolkien's head was, I believe, radically different from the version of history that most people have in their heads. For him, British history was a story of desperate, heroic resistance, violence, and constant terrible defeat at the hands of evil tyrants. And I'm going to give a kind of ladybird synopsis of how Catholic history looks to people like Tolkien. Ladybird, of course, would not give such a synopsis, and that's one of my points. The landscape is scarred by the violence of the past, violence in which our people were driven out of what we had built for God. Our places were either turned over to the use of our most bitter enemies or destroyed. We ourselves were hunted, persecuted, not allowed to enter any profession, any educational institution, unless we gave up who we were. Those few of us who held out, who resisted, were targeted for extermination, first by crushing fines and then by actual arrest, torture, and execution. The ordinary wife of a butcher was pressed to death. Our enemies lied and pretended this was not about who we were and what we believed. They pretended that our beliefs made us traitors, and they almost made it true. When we fought back, they escalated the persecution. When we tried to support our leaders, they turned on us all the more. Our religion, our identity, is not one that can be practiced solely in our heads as theirs can be. We can only be ourselves in a community with access to priests. But they made priests illegal and pretended they were tolerating us. When priests tried to continue their work, the government ripped out their hearts in the public marketplace. There is only a small marker on the pavement to show where they did that. And to this day, most people don't even know that it happened. Now, very few people who are not cradle Catholics themselves have any sense of how important the differences are between this historical narrative of Catholicism and the historical narrative generally offered as official history. And indeed, after the reforms of Vatican II, not even all Catholics are as conscious of this history as Tolkien was. Greater care was taken when Tolkien was a child to instruct young Catholics in the history of their church in England, and this was often done through a novel called Come Rack, Come Rope, a historical novel published in 1912 by the English priest and writer Robert Hugh Benson. The novel features Edmund Campion, one of the most hunted priests in the kingdom, famous for his preaching, not least his preaching at Oxford. He was a fellow of Exeter College. The novel ends with a harrowing scene of torture and the execution of the main character because he has been betrayed by his father, in direct analogy with the earliest version of Tolkien's portrayal of the fall of Numenor. The traces of this historical trauma are everywhere in the British landscape. But Tolkien's imagination, I will argue, worked upon them so that nothing is a crude allegory or a direct reference. Instead, the Catholic version of British history operates as a subtext in his work and keeps materializing and bobbing up in a variety of forms. Today, I have time to deal with only two examples of this. The first is the insistent presence of ruins in the landscape, and the second is two particular narratives of the triumph of evil and the shape that that evil takes. So let's do ruins first. As Michael Jewett has noted, the emotional resonances of the physical ruins spread throughout the landscape, the broken foundations on Weathertop, the decayed castles in the lone lands, the ancient remains that surround the Fellowship as they travel through the land of Hollin, lost Aragaion, the tumbled stones that speak a paraphrase of the Anglo-Saxon poem The Ruin to Legolas. Despite the fact that the characters in the Fellowship of the Ring pass through a number of ruins, the first full consciousness of them comes when the Nine Walkers reach what used to be Hollin. Here, the stones themselves have a voice. Only the stones lament them. Deep they delved us, fair they wrought us, high they builded us, but they are gone. They are gone. They sought the havens long ago. The ruins of Hollin are especially important But it's worth noting that there are so many ruins. There's Amunsul, Numenas, Cairn Doom, Dale before the fall of Smorg, Fornost, Framsburg, Osgiliath, Austin, Edel. Ruins in Middle-earth have been linked to the Anglo-Saxon poem, as in the quotation I just read out, and also to Romanticism. But for Tolkien, I'm going to suggest a different significance may have been at work, and a different set of stories. Here is an anonymous poem from the late 16th century, and this is item 1 on the handout. Level, level with the ground, the towers do lie, which with their golden glittering tops pierced once the sky. I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling that that could actually be attributed to Tolkien. It sounds so Tolkien-like. It's actually often a poem, often assigned the title Lament for Walsingham. It's about the destruction of the shrine and abbey of Our Lady of Walsingham, which was founded in 1061 when an Anglo-Saxon nobleman experienced a vision of the Virgin Mary, and the Virgin Mary commissioned her to build a replica of the Holy Family's house in Nazareth as a shrine in Norfolk, and in commemoration of the Annunciation. Walsingham, therefore, has, I'm going to suggest, a particular affinity with the elven kingdoms of Middle-earth, in that it is a replica of a physical holiness somewhere else, an attempt materially to construct a version of something once experienced directly but no longer available in that form. The Holy House at Walsingham housed a wooden statue of the enthroned Virgin Mary holding the child Jesus on her lap. And among the relics in the Holy House was a phial of what was said to be Our Lady's breast milk. The shrine was a very popular destination for pilgrims and actually overtook Canterbury as the most popular pilgrimage site in England in the 15th century. Until, says Wikipedia, the English Reformation in 1538, when the shrine was, and I quote directly from Wikipedia in all its august wisdom, dismantled. That word dismantled and the similar usage on every National Trust sign in the land of the word dissolution are very frankly weasel words. We wouldn't normally describe Coventry Cathedral as dismantled or dissolved. We would normally say that Coventry Cathedral had been destroyed by enemy action. For Tolkien, the shrine at Walsingham suffered a similar fate. The fact that we don't say destroyed illustrates our hobbit-like incomprehension of the ruins among which we walk. In a very Tolkien way, the destruction of Walsingham also involved treason. In 1537, when the last prior, Richard Vowell, was paying obsequious respect to Thomas Cromwell, the sub-prior, Nicholas Millam, was charged with conspiring to rebel against the suppression of the monasteries, and on flimsy evidence was convicted of high treason and hanged outside the priory walls. 11 people in all connected with Walsingham, including 2 lay choristers, who had been allegedly instrumental in organizing the revolt to save the abbey, were hanged, drawn, and quartered. And in this context of violent suppression and violent warlike destruction, it's significant that Tolkien sketched the evocative ruins of Whitby Abbey, which met an identical fate in the same period, and that's number 2 on your handout. Majestically misunderstanding the matter, the website that reproduces his sketches describes the result as hobbit frightening castles. Sorry, whoever Tolkien specialist that is for trashing you, but really? It would be more accurate to say that for Tolkien, the ruins were not so much frightening as a desperately sad relic of what had once been a society which would seamlessly have fitted with the world of his imagination. And I'm just going to remind everyone at this point that, remember, he said he was creating a mythology for England. I think this was a big part of what he meant. This early sketch, then, is a first try at capturing what Tolkien later described in a letter as the heart-racking sense of the vanished past, best expressed by Gandalf's words about the Palantir. And in the letter, he goes on to expand on this with regard in particular to the destruction of the elven realm in Aragaian. I think, he says to Christopher, you are moved by Celebrimbor because it conveys a sudden sense of endless untold stories. Tolkien's interest in untold stories was, I contend, not merely literary, but specifically connected with the hidden and indeed destroyed Catholic history of England. It went with the idea of a secret underground or hidden stronghold that survives by being perpetually hidden and depends on the loyalty of its inhabitants to avoid betrayal, an idea increasingly fundamental to the Catholic history of England after the destruction of the monasteries. After Henry VIII imposed his authority on the church and was succeeded by his more violently Protestant son Edward and his equally violently Protestant daughter Elizabeth, Catholicism survived only in a few isolated great houses and a few isolated noble and gentry families, in a manner loosely analogous to the way in which Elven culture, Northern culture in particular, survives in Middle-earth. It was possible to be Catholic only under the protection of such a family. Successively, these strongholds were spied upon and betrayed, along with those who lived in them, in much the way that we see the fall successively of the Northern strongholds in the First Age. The reason for that in Catholic England, the remnant of Catholic England, was the vicious Secret Service under Sir Francis Walsingham, and the role of treason and spying and betrayal predominates in Tolkien's understanding of what might lead a stronghold to fall, just as it was central to the fate of Catholics in England. In particular, what Tolkien tries to grasp, and I think is reading through Come Rack, Come Rope, the interplay of envy and the use of torture in the fall of Gondolin, through the traitor Maglin's betrayal, is deeply imbued with Catholic history and betrayals. And I turn now to the passage that's number 3 on the handout. He threatened Maglin with unimaginable torment. Bless you. And though Maglin was no craven, he was cowed by Morgoth's threats and betrayed the location and weaknesses of Gondolin in exchange for his freedom. Morgoth was overjoyed to obtain this information, and to further encourage Maglin and ensure both his silence and his further aid, Morgoth promised him both rule of the city and the hand of Idril once Turgon was overthrown. Maglin assented eagerly to this bargain. Tolkien would have known in writing that passage that the Jesuit Edmund Campion was also betrayed by a spy. We actually know the spy's name was George Eliot, who had pretended to be Catholic and attended one of Campion's secret masses. And he probably also knew the story that Campion had been offered the Archbishopric of Canterbury if he recanted his Catholic faith and turned back to the Protestant Church. So there are many parallels there with what happens to Maglin. It's particularly salient to think of Campion because of what Campion said in condemnation of those who condemned him. In condemning us, you condemn all your own ancestors, he said, all our ancient bishops and kings, all that was once the glory of England, the islands of saints, and the most devoted child of the See of Peter. I'm going to suggest, therefore, that it's Edmund Campion that is the model, but a reverse model for traitors like Maglin. And there are many other examples that we could discuss at question time. The complex fate of Celebrimbor himself echoes that of those who converted from Protestantism to Catholicism, as Campion did. Campion started as Protestant. Celebrimbor was, open quotes, not corrupted in heart or faith, but had accepted Sauron as what he posed to be. And when at length he discovered the existence of the One Ring, he revolted against Sauron. Sauron greets this rebellion with ferocity and destroys the entire realm. Celebrimbor is duly captured in the chaos and forced under torture to disclose the locations of the lesser rings. This is analogous to the way Catholics were tortured during the reign of Elizabeth I to get them to reveal the locations of hidden Catholic treasures, Catholic booksellers, and Catholic priests. Celebrimbor, like most of those tortured by Richard Topcliffe, Elizabeth's chief torturer, a man who literally had a rack in his front room so that he could torture without any legal restrictions or authorization, is willing to give some information, and that's what most Jesuits did too. But he would not reveal the whereabouts of the three. Like many Catholic priests and Catholic lay people, Celebrimbor dies from his torment, and his body was shot with arrows, so even though he's dead, they ritually execute him as well. Significantly, his body was then displayed, open quotes, hung upon a pole, and was later paraded as a banner when Sauron attacked the Grey Havens. That's in Unfinished Tales. Similarly, the execution of Catholic priests and lay people was itself a form of violent display through the hanging, drawing, and quartering process. Victims were partially hanged by strangulation, typically cut down while still alive, then had, brace yourselves, their external genitalia removed and burned before their eyes, then had their intestines removed and also burned, and finally had their hearts pulled out before they were beheaded and cut into quarters so that both the head and quarters could be displayed. And you can see a German depiction of this as number 4 on the handout. The history of Numenor, similarly, is not an allegory of Catholic England, but is, I think, like the fall of Celebrimbor and the fall of Aragorn, a parsing of a historical trauma in the same way that Frodo and Sam's journey to Mordor is, we now understand through the work of John Garth, a processing of Tolkien's experiences in World War I. Tolkien despised allegory because it oversimplifies. By contrast, I argue, this part of the legendarium acts as a commentary and reflection on the history of Catholic England. But it would also be accurate to say that for Tolkien, history is simply shaped like this. This is simply how history is. So the Land of the Star, Andor, is created for people with something close to, if not identical with, a particular religious allegiance. And it's created as a refuge, that word again, Tolkien's very sold on refuges, very Catholic idea, from the dangers of Middle-earth. It's sundered from both Valinor and Middle-earth. It's a kind of third term between the Undying Realm and the mortal realms. And like the Magi, the chosen men follow a star to it, the Star of Arundel, so that the land itself is almost the nativity of an incarnate blessedness shimmering in a golden haze. Arguably, this connects to the Catholic idea that England had a special status in heaven as Our Lady's dowry. This is an idea that dates from the High Middle Ages, it's first spoken about in about 1350. And as Hiley notes, after Protestantism, Catholics kept alive the idea of England's privileged place within Christendom through the tradition that England was particularly under the protection of Our Lady and had particularly been given to English Catholics by Our Lady, an idea also strongly connected with the shrine at Walsingham. So although the outward signs of Marian devotion, like shrines and statues, were no longer publicly visible in England, the country remained under Mary's special protection. And there's an analogy there with Numenor, not least because it's the idea that there's something special about being a gift, about a land that's a gift, and a land that you're given because of your religious allegiance. So the first and second drafts of the fall of Numenor significantly center on the period not of the establishment of Numenor as we might expect, but the starting point for Tolkien appears to have been the story of tyranny and oppression rather than the birth of Numenorean culture. In a structure that directly echoes the structure of come rack, come rope, a conflict arises between a father and a son about the new religion introduced to Numenor, first by its rulers and then by Sauron. In Numenor, this conversation between father and son is overshadowed, just as it would have been in Catholic England, not only by an anxiety about one member of the duo's growing submission to an alien and indeed, as it turns out, diabolical alternative religion, but also by legitimate fears that the conversation might be overheard, a sense of coercion that also haunts the narrative of Benson's novel Come Rack, Come Rope. In Tolkien's case, he flips it. In Benson's novel, the father is the traitor and the son becomes a priest. In Tolkien's narrative, it's the son that's the traitor and the father that remains loyal to the traditional religion. But this passage tells us how preoccupied Tolkien was with what Catholics tend loosely to call penal times. Do not ask and do not speak so loud. Herendel turned away and lay prone with his face buried in his hands. Thou knowest it is dangerous, to us all. Whatever he be, Sauron is mighty and hath ears. I fear the dungeons, and I love thee, I love thee. Again, this is directly an echo of a conversation between, in this case, the loyal son and the heretic father in Come Rack, Come Rope, in which the son explicitly warns his father about the risk of hellfire, and the father responds by warning the son about the penal risks that he faces. Number 5 on your handout is Christopher Tolkien's summary of what's going on in Numenor in this period. the unexplained disappearance of people unpopular with the open quotes government, close quotes, informers, prisons, torture, secrecy, fear of the night, propaganda in the form of the rewriting of history, as exemplified by Herendel's words concerning what was now said about Arundel, the multiplication of weapons of war, the purpose of which is concealed but guessed at, and behind all the dreadful figure of Sauron, the real power, surveying the whole land from the mountain of Numenor. Every item in this summary pertains directly to Catholic history under Elizabeth. Central to this early version of Tolkien's narrative is the distorting conquest of history itself. Open quotes. They say now that the tale was altered by the Arisaeans, this is the heretic son Herendel speaking, who were slaves of the lords, that in truth Arundel was an adventurer and showed us the way, and that the lords took him captive for that reason, so that his work is perforce unfinished. So Tolkien is here putting into the mouth of Herendel a version of Numenorian history that the reader already knows to be false, and a version of Numenorian history that, moreover, justifies the imperialist expansion that Numenor is then undergoing. And I've been pondering whether Tolkien is making a link between what for him was the false religion of Protestantism and the expansion of the Elizabethan Empire and the sea-going sea dogs. This is really the nub of the entire matter. For Tolkien, history had been dramatically altered and falsified because it was written by the winners, and he and his family, and particularly his mother, were not among those winners. The identity of the men of the West is organized, we learn, around language. The kings take their names in Quenya, the noblest tongue of the world, as Tolkien calls it, and the abandonment of this traditional language is one of the first signs that the regime is now deeply corrupt and committed to publicizing its own corruption. When Vatican II abandoned the Latin Mass, there are wonderful stories about Tolkien standing at the back and continuing to make the responses in Latin, rather like the faithful continuing to use Quenya in secret. And in that way, he is actually paradoxically acting out what his ancestors also did, as we shall learn. The key thing here is that the king who moves from using Quenya to using the Adonaic language promptly bans Quenya. That is, he doesn't just change the practice, but forbids that religion to others. And this, of course, is exactly what happened to Catholics. It was even possible for residually Catholic women to be accused of witchcraft on the grounds that they continued to practice Catholicism by praying in Latin, and this was interpreted as demon worship as early as 1566. Moreover, the title that our Adonakor takes means Lord of the West. This is interpreted by the remnant of the faithful, and Tolkien always calls them the remnant in that way, as blasphemy, because that title, Lord of the West, is properly the title of Manwë. And I'm going to suggest, maybe a bit daringly, that Manwë is a bit like the Pope. He's the representative of God in creation. He's the aspect of Iluvatar that has to do with the created realm. So the usurpation of his title is perhaps roughly analogous to Henry VIII declaring himself supreme head of the church. And the act of supremacy was still imposed by all his descendants, including Elizabeth I. You had to sign up to the act of supremacy. People tend to credit Elizabeth with way more leniency than is really justified. The use of the term the faithful is also significant, suggesting that loyalty to the religion of old is of value in itself. Those who remain loyal, even though they are not rebellious, are subject increasingly to persecution and ultimately even to human sacrifice. And that, I think, is probably how Catholics looked to Tolkien in Tudor and Stuart times. Again, this is not an allegory, but a series of active ideas inspired by history about what the triumph of evil really looks like. Initially, the kings rebel on their own behalf against the laws and customs that they've adhered to before. But that rebellion invites in the true face of evil, and after Sauron gains influence, the king literally turns back to the worship of the dark. The king's former friend, Amandil, is left alone, and, open quotes, all that he trusted is still to be faithful. He summoned to come hither in secret, for he feared that the evil would now grow apace, and that all the elf friends were in peril, and so it soon came to pass. Amandil's role as patriarch and keeper of the faithful is analogous to that taken by the leaders of the great Catholic families, and also of men like Thomas More, who sought to protect the entire residual Catholic community. But under the increasingly violent rule of Sauron, religion is forbidden. The Meneltarma itself is forbidden. Though not even, this is number 6 on your handout, though not even Sauron dared to defile the high place, yet the king would let no man on pain of death ascend to it, not even those of the faithful who kept a Iluvatar in their hearts. This echoes and may even have been inspired by the destruction of shrines and monasteries, and indeed the destruction of religious ritual and the deformation of the use of churches. Further iconoclasm is in store for the Numenorians, and Sauron urged the king to cut down the white tree, for it was a memorial of the Eldar and the light of Valinor. Superstitiously, at first the king would not assent to this, we are told, since he believed the fortunes of his house were bound up with the tree. In his folly, he who now hated the Eldar and the Valar vainly clung to the shadow of the old allegiance of Numenor. And I interpret this as to do with the Church of England inhabiting what were churches built by Catholics. That they don't recognize why they're actually sacred, but they get the connection somehow, and they therefore want to continue to be in them and not build their own churches. This is something virtually every Catholic will tell you. Why do we have to have the concrete places in the suburbs? Hate for Tolkien was the raison d'etre of the Church of England, and he literally says this. In a letter he wrote, "Hatred of our church is, after all, the real only final foundation of the C of E, so deep laid that it remains even when all the superstructure seems removed." And in another letter, he also writes about hate as a fear of anything large and alive, and I think those ideas are probably connected for him. So what then happens in Numenor is that they do start building their own stuff. They build a new temple under Sauron's direction, and it's crowned with a mighty dome. I can't help thinking of the Christopher Wren St. Paul's there. And the first fire on the altar Sauron kindled with the hewn wood of the white tree, and it crackled and was consumed, and there's a sort of supernatural presence with it. I suspect this may echo the burning of a fire on a pyre made of wooden statues. Yeah, this really happened. So John Forrest was confessor to Queen Catherine of Aragon and was burned to death at Smithfield for heresy because he refused to acknowledge Henry VIII as head of the church. It was unusual for someone to be burned as a Catholic. Normally Catholics tended to be hanged, drawn and quartered. So it's a unique case, but it's very symbolically laden. In a very Tolkien way, there was a prophecy about the statue which was used to fuel the fire. The statue was of a guy called St. Durfall. It was an enormous statue, and it was said that one day it would set a forest on fire, and the guy was called John Forrest, so they kind of thought it was funny to burn him on the statue. Funny and cruel. His death was brought about by Archbishops Thomas Cranmer and Hugh Latimer acting on behalf of Thomas Cromwell. And we oddly enough don't hear much about this burning from John Foxe or any of his admirers. It's also interesting to note that the very idea of having an Archbishop of Canterbury would to Tolkien have been like the reluctance to cut down the white tree. So number 7 on your handout, in Numenor, in that temple, with spilling of blood and torment and great wickedness, men made sacrifices to Melkor that he should release them from death. So this is a religious event. And most often from among the faithful they chose their victims, yet never openly on the charge that they would not worship Melkor, the giver of freedom. Rather was cause sought against them that they hated the king and were his rebels, that they plotted against their king, devising lies and poisons. That's a very kind of absolutely 100% accurate representation of what the Elizabethan regime does. Approximately 150 Catholics were executed, and nearly all of them were executed ostensibly for treason, because it was then reframed as treason to be a Catholic in the sense of harboring a priest or having the sacraments. So that seems to me the most exact of all the analogies I've been locating. And Tolkien adds fairly, because he's such a fair-minded person, these charges were for the most part false, yet those were bitter days, and hate brings forth hate. So that's very telling too, and he's kind of owning up to the Babington plot, which indeed features very largely in Cumrac, Cumrope. and it's always condemned. And Catholics of Tolkien's generation are particularly eager to denounce any idea that they were ever traitors. So I think he's also saying that. So for me, this evening I've been trying to show you part of what I think haunted Tolkien all his life. A powerful sense of wrongness. What Newman wrote about when he said that something has gone wrong with the world. What Tolkien wrote about when he spoke about the war and said something has gone crack. The idea overall that happens over and over again in his work that the wrong side keeps winning, that inexplicably, unfairly, and unjustly, decent people are cast out of what they've made, usually through treason, that it's an uphill struggle for good to triumph, and when it does, the triumph is only partial. It's often been suggested that this is because of his experiences in the First World War, or because he's just a declinist, classicist type who's kind of always segueing from a golden age to an iron age. And those things are partly true, but I think his declinist worldview strongly comes from his Catholic background, not least because, just a final point, he strongly believed his mother was a martyr. You may or may not all know this, but this was because his mother, who suffered with diabetes, was disowned by her family, as was her sister, Tolkien's aunt, because both of them converted to Catholicism. And therefore, the family of Tolkien's mother, Mabel, wouldn't give her any money or wouldn't help her support Tolkien and his brother Hilary. And that's why they were in such abject poverty. Indeed, the only people who helped were Catholic clergy. And it's also why it ended up with an Oratorian priest as Tolkien's guardian rather than a member of the family. For Tolkien, and he literally says this in a letter, his mother was a martyr. So she was actually one of the people who suffered because of anti-Catholic discrimination exercised in this case by her family, and from his point of view suffered violently in the way of the martyrs of the past. Thank you.